I live in a substantially normal neighborhood. I can't really say that most of the people here are shady. Most of them are just old. To give a little background on my town, most of the streets are parallel to each other, especially the section I live in. There's a lot of young people moving in because many of the old people in the town are moving into nursing homes or unfortunately dying. I think it would be safe to say I know most of the people who live in the area. Not personally, but I can definitely recognize faces. So anyway, last year my friends and I decided to go out trick-or-treating one final time. We were acting like angsty teenagers who thought it wasn't cool anymore. We had already gotten costumes and wanted some candy right now. However, even though we didn't think it was cool, looking back I don't think trick-or-treating is safe anymore, truly. Anyway, I had to play a field hockey game after school, so I was itching to hang out with my friends. I finally headed home and got my costume on. At this point it was getting dark, so my mom demanded I bring a flashlight. She's very protective and kinda strict. My dad, on the other hand, is the opposite. He's more willing to let me do things and go places on my own and convinced my mom it would be okay if I went trick-or-treating with a group of friends. My mom doesn't like there not being a parent around, but she knew we would stay within a couple of streets. Eventually she let up and allowed me to go. My friends began to show up at my house, but by the time we left, it was pitch black. Once again my mom warned us about strangers. I scoffed at her, trying to shake off the embarrassment of being lectured by my mom in front of my friends. I knew she was right though, but maybe a group of high school girls could take down a predator, but I know I couldn't by myself. I stayed as close as I could to my friends for most of the night, keeping an eye out for any weird figures or killer clowns, since there were rumors of some terrorizing an elementary school a few towns over. Everything seemed to be going really well and we were having a really good time. Apart from trying to avoid our classmates out of sheer humility for trick-or-treating, all my friends and I made some really good memories that night. But then it happened. It was around 8:45 and some of my friends were tired and really wanted to be picked up. We gradually made it back to my house where they phoned their parents and left. I was a little upset. It might have been my inner child in me, but I wanted more candy. I knew this was quite possibly my last year trick-or-treating ever, and I wasn't ready to give up yet. My one friend, we'll call her Nancy, did not want to stop either. After all, my other friend left. We then asked my parents if we could go out for another 30 minutes or so. My mom was reluctant. However, my dad told her I was old enough and most people wouldn't answer the door this late anyway, so we would be back pretty soon. It was about 9:10 at this point. Nancy and I went over to the next street in the opposite direction we went with our group earlier. I remember feeling uncomfortable for some reason, but brushed it off as I turned on my flashlight. It was pitch black and the sidewalks were bumpy and cracked because the town was too lazy to fix them. I had a pretty bright flashlight and could shine a good 20 feet ahead of me. We then made it to the next street over and looked down. There were barely any porch lights on. I guess people figured the little kids were done and decided it was the end of the night. However, Nancy and I were not willing to give up and started at the first house on the left. No answer. We then went across the street to another house that had a porch light on. Still no answer from that house either. I still wasn't giving up though. We tried a few more houses and got no answers. Nancy then suggested we try 3 other houses, and if no one answered, we would then go back to my place. I agreed, sadly knowing that no one would give us candy this late into the night, and that it was the end. That's when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. It was a black figure walking down the road towards the house Nancy and I were standing at. He was wearing all black with his face down and hood over his head. Something about him made my stomach lurch. I discreetly pointed him out to Nancy. She said she saw him a few houses before, just turning onto the street. This made me feel even more uneasy. Quickly he began to approach us with his head down and his hands in his sweatshirt pocket. Looking back, who knows what he could have been hiding in there. The street was dead quiet except for Nancy and I, so he must have heard us. I instructed for us to go to the house across the street, to make it seem like we were trick-or-treating and never noticed the man. We then went to the house across the road and knocked on the door. I was secretly praying someone would answer so the man could not get near, but no one did. I was really freaking out now. I turned around and he was walking on the street in front of the house right next to us. Then I realized he had crossed the street too. A wave of panic then overtook me. I grabbed Nancy's arm and sprinted to the house he had just passed. Then, he circled around and began following us in the same direction. I knew I had to do something. He began walking faster and faster towards us. Nancy and I then sprinted for it. There's a good amount of space in between this street and mine, but I was on track and willing to do anything to get away from the psychopath. He didn't run, but when I finally looked back, I saw him quickly walking the same way, still with his head down. From what I could tell, he seemed fairly young, maybe in his early 30s. I didn't recognize anyone like this from the area, though. Nancy and I were still running, though, Finally, we made it to my street and we hid near some bushes at the end. Then I realized we still had our flashlights on, and that's how he was able to see us so easily. We shut them off, crouched near the bushes, and waited. I knew that if we tried to run to my house, he would see us. There wasn't enough time to make it back without him getting to the end of the street and seeing us. I was also terrified that he would find out where I lived. Never bring someone who's following you back to your house, I thought. Nancy and I finally saw him. He stood in the middle of the street and just peered down at it. I could see his eyes, that's how close we were. They looked so blank and menacing. He knew we were somewhere, just not in the bushes only 10 feet away. After a few moments, he carried on walking. Nancy and I waited until he was at the next street and then we booked it back to my place. I told my parents, but my father only laughed and my mother looked too tired to care. My brother made fun of me for being too paranoid. I'm never going trick-or-treating again. Who knows what could have happened to me that night, or what that man was capable of. Later, there was a news report about children who had been abducted a few towns over. Instead, it could have been me and Nancy. This took place a while ago. I was 13 and my family had just moved to a new town. Myself and a new friend of mine from school made plans to go trick-or-treating together. At the time, I remember thinking I was a bit too old to still be trick-or-treating, but who doesn't want free candy? My friend and I figured we still had one more year of trick-or-treating left in us. Because we were 13 and lived in a fairly safe neighborhood, my parents thought it was okay for us to go trick-or-treating alone, without any adult supervision. Everything was going great and we were having a fun time, getting some solid candy. Then we rang on one guy's doorbell. The porch light was on, and there was a pumpkin or two, so we figured the people in the house were likely to be handing out candy. A middle-aged man opened the door. At first I was glad because he was dressed in a costume and happy to see my friend and I, so I felt like we were in for some top-tier candy. I don't even remember what candy he handed out, but I do remember what happened next. He asked us to enter his home, which is weird, but we were only 13, so we didn't really think anything of it. Then he asked if he could take our photo. He said he always liked to take the photos of every kid's every Halloween because he loved seeing their costumes. On one of the walls, he had a bunch of pictures of different random unrelated children in Halloween costumes. At this point, even being a dumb 13-year-old, I was really starting to get creeped out. But I figured it was best not to upset the man and let him take his picture, and then we could leave. So he snaps a photo of us, and then he pulls out a clipboard with a sheet of paper on it, with a bunch of names written in childish writing. He said he particularly likes the kids who sign their name to the photo, so he can know exactly who they are. At this point, we were both mega creeped out. We should have just ran out of there. We were too conditioned not to be rude. I decided to sign a fake name. He then looked at the paper, looked back at me, then down at the paper, then repeated the fake name I'd given him, and nodded. Luckily, after that, he didn't do anything, and we were free to leave. But it definitely creeped us both out. At the time, I thought he was just an eccentric guy, but as an adult looking back on the story, it seems much more sinister. I'm so glad nothing bad ever happened to us, and all I can do is hope nothing bad happens to anyone else. Halloween with all these costume kids trick-or-treating in the dark with minimal parental supervision is a great opportunity for predators to get kids alone in their homes, with no one ever knowing the kids' whereabouts. Please stay safe out there, and happy Halloween. So this happened on Halloween when I was about 11. My friend and I decided to go trick-or-treating. We were a little bit too old, but we wanted some free candy anyway. I lived in a very nice neighborhood, one of those ones where everyone gives out full-size candy bars, so it wasn't unusual to have a lot of people come there to trick-or-treat. However, there was also about an acre of front yard for each house, so it takes about 3 minutes to walk between each door. It was a good night for Halloween weather-wise, not too chilly, not rainy or anything. So it's approaching 8:30 p.m., and after hanging out around the golf course and appreciating our candy haul, we decided to start heading home and call it a night. The street I live on is a gigantic U-shape, like a little over a half-mile walk from the top of the U down the bend to the other side. We were walking towards the end of the U further from my house as we wanted to take the long way, since it was such a nice night. It's about 9 p.m. now, so no one else is really out anymore at this point, and people turned off their porch lights, the universal signal for no more trick-or-treaters. That's when we noticed a lone white van parked on the street. We made a joke about how it looks like one of those stereotypical kidnap vans with the painted windows. That's when we noticed it shift out of park and slowly creep down the street towards us and park at the next house. They probably had kids trick-or-treating, we thought. It wasn't uncommon for people to drive their kids from house to house, since they were so spread out in our neighborhood. But given that it was 9 p.m. at night, with such nice weather, it struck us as a bit odd. We checked every few minutes and it seemed to just be stopping from house to house, like normal. We turned around again and kept on walking, at a leisurely pace, gossiping and whatnot. That's when we hear the car squeal as it moved forward down the hill and park again, this time only about 2 houses away from us, on the opposite side of the street. Again, we were timed to be trick-or-treating, or whatever. That's when we realized there was no kids getting out of the van, not once. Now this was way before my first phone, and we were only 15 minutes away from my house but a bit disturbed, so we walked to the nearest door, rang the bell, and stuck out our bags in an attempt to act normal. A woman then opens the door just a crack, and proceeds to berate us for trying to trick-or-treat at this late hour, and slams the door before we could even say a word. We then turn around and the van is right there, parked in the wrong direction on our side of the street. The windows are tinted so you can't even see the guy driving. Trying to keep it cool, we casually walk away from the door and up the street into the cul-de-sac loop that's on the other side of the street that makes up the bigger U. If you cut through that loop and hop a couple fences, you can end up at my back door. The van goes the same way. Now we know he's following us, since there's no reason for him to go up this side street otherwise. We then break into a sprint, and I am by no means athletic, but I hop those damn fences like an Olympian. We then run inside my house, lock all the doors, and freak out while we sit in the front hall. Not even 5 minutes later, the van slowly drives down the street and past my house. I always wondered what could have happened if we hadn't been aware of our surroundings.